all injustices, whether it's racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, environmental degradation, problematic, toxic workplaces, domestic abuse, all injustices share a common denominator, which is relational dysfunction. This is dysfunctional ways of relating.
Today, we welcome back to the podcast Dr. Melanie Joy, a renowned psychologist and author all about compassionate living. Dr. Joy is the president of Beyond Carnism, a nonprofit organization transforming the invisible belief system that makes it okay to eat and torture animals. Her groundbreaking concept, Carnism, has sparked global conversations about the psychology behind meat consumption. She's also the author of 6 books, and she appeared on our show in episode 52 to discuss her bestseller, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And that book unravels how societal conditioning influences our affection for some animals while accepting others as food sources. And today, she is here to discuss with me her new book, How to End Injustice Everywhere. We will also discuss concepts available on her new website, infighting.org, which addresses internal conflicts within social justice movements and other organizations. Throughout her career, Dr. Joy's work has inspired us to improve our relationships, question cultural norms, and make conscious choices that align with our deepest values. So, get ready for an enlightening discussion as we explore how we can be better with ourselves, others, and the planet. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Joy. And thanks for being here all the way from Berlin.
Yeah, well, all the way. This is the beauty of the digital age, right? Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And as I was saying before, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. We begged you. A lot of people come to us to be on our show. As soon as I saw that you had this new book out, I was like, we have to talk about it. So tell us about your new book, How to End Injustice Everywhere. What was what prompted you to write it?
Well, in a lot of ways, How to End Injustice Everywhere was sort of like a natural evolution. It grew out of the work that I did on Carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat animals, certain animals. It was the evolution of my thinking after I wrote Why We Love Dogs, and I had identified this invisible system, Carnism, and really deconstructed it, really looked at it and said, how does this system fit together? How does it stay alive? How is it that people who care about animals, people who are, otherwise rational thinkers in many ways, nevertheless contribute directly and consistently to completely unnecessary and really intensive harm to billions, trillions of non-human beings every year. And so, the work that I had done really analyzing Carnism, looking at the structure of the system, really breaking down and understanding the specific mentality that gives rise to the system and keeps it alive, and that is reinforced by the system as well, wasn't really just specific to Carnism, to people's relationships with farmed animals, essentially. When I did my research, it was my doctoral research that I did when I was really trying to understand the psychology of eating animals. And I had this question in my mind: how is it that compassionate, rational people can, act in ways that are uncompassionate and irrational without realizing what they're doing? And how is it that they can become so defensive, whenever we try to help them recognize the inconsistencies in their attitudes and their behaviors? And so what I came out with, of course, was my theory of Carnism. I had identified and deconstructed Carnism and what I called the Carnistic mentality. But I also had more than that. I had a blueprint. I had a blueprint for understanding psychology of, we could call it injustice, or oppression is the most extreme form or notable form of injustice, the psychology of injustice more broadly. And so over the years, as I've done more work on, talking about Carnism, raising awareness about Carnism, building out my work on healthy relationality and relationships, I started to think more and more and more about what the psychology, not just of carnism, but the psychology of injustice more broadly looks like. And so I wrote How to End Injustice Everywhere, really to shed light on the common structure of all unjust systems, patriarchy, racism, classism. They can be smaller systems as well, toxic workplaces, abusive or dysfunctional relationships, and also to shed light on the common mentality that drives them, right? So one goal of the book is to help advocates who are working to end any form of injustice, injustice against humans, non-humans, or the planet, to understand the interconnectedness of all injustices. All of these injustices stem from this common denominator. And with this understanding, advocates for humans, animals, and the environment they're better able to support rather than thwart each other's efforts, and also to unify across causes. And another goal of writing the book is to help, or motivation for writing the book, is to help those who are working for progressive causes to more effectively advocate to others. Because the very same psychology that drives injustice is the psychology that also drives those of us who are advocates to communicate in ways that can create the opposite outcomes of what we want. And finally, I wrote the book because I wanted to provide practical tools to help advocates reduce infighting and to build more resilient and impactful groups and movements for justice. I know we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but infighting is a problem. This is not just infighting, which is like extreme fighting of advocates, but it's also something that happens, within organizations and grassroots groups, in all different movements. And it's a big problem. It's causing our movements and groups for justice to cannibalize themselves in some ways.
Ironically, yes. The subtitle of your book is Understanding the Common Denominator, Driving All Injustices to Create a Better World for Humans, Animals, and the Planet. And you mentioned just now that there is a common denominator. But you teased us. What is it, the common? Can you sum it up, or does it take a whole book to parse out?
Well, I can sum it up.
Okay.
So all injustices, whether it's racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, environmental degradation, problematic, toxic workplaces, domestic abuse, all injustices share a common denominator, which is relational dysfunction. This is dysfunctional ways of relating. Okay. Dysfunctional ways of relating are ways of relating that cause problems in people, in relationships, in the experience. So dysfunctional ways of relating to other individuals, between social groups, and also to non-human animals and the environment. Now, this relational dysfunction, these problematic ways of relating, it stems from a particular psychology. I call this it stems from a mentality, essentially, and I call this the non-relational mentality. It's a mentality that causes people to think, and therefore to feel, and therefore to act in ways that violate their integrity, right? And when we act in ways that violate our integrity, that means basically we don't practice the golden rule of treating others the way that we would want to be treated, right? So our integrity is the integration of our values and our practices. And the two most commonly espoused values in the world are the values of compassion, or caring for others, and justice, doing what's fair, right? So when we practice integrity, we're practicing these values. We're treating others the way that we would want to be treated if we were in their position. And so this non-relational mentality causes people to violate their integrity and harm the dignity of others. Dignity is your sense of inherent worth, right? Intrinsic worth, right? So when you harm somebody's dignity, that means you think of them and treat them as though they're less worthy of being treated with respect or of occupying place on the planet than you or others are. And so this mentality that drives us to violate our integrity and harm the dignity of others, it results in a sense of disconnection and a sense of insecurity between us. And we'll talk about this a lot more, we'll unpack it. And it also results in unjust power imbalances. So to really sum this up, the common denominator of all injustices, it's a common denominator. There are multiple common denominators, but a very important one that has not gotten the attention that it deserves is relational dysfunction. And this relational dysfunction, these dysfunctional ways of relating, result from a particular mentality. And it's a mentality in which we perceive and treat others as though they are less than. They are less worthy than we or anybody else is of having their dignity honored, of being respected, of occupying space on this planet. And the result is insecurity, disconnection, and unjust power imbalances. And I know that's a mouthful, it's a lot, but we can unpack all of that. But this really is, this mentality is the core. And so, if we don't change the way we think, when we identify this mentality and see it for what it is, and it's not a mystery, it doesn't have to be a big abstraction. Like, it's based on a certain thought processes, it's based on certain assumptions. And the behaviors it gives rise to are very concrete and very recognizable when we really understand what they are and what to look for. And so if we don't recognize this mentality and really target the psychology, the mentality underlying all forms of injustice, then we're just going to trade one form of injustice for another as we work to create a better world. We work to liberate one group while we're throwing other groups under the bus, or we work to liberate multiple groups while we're, treating the people in our immediate orbit badly, or we work for compassion and justice in the world while we berate and demean those who disagree with us. So we really need to understand the way that we think so that we can shift the way we think. It's not enough to just look at who is oppressing or abusing whom. We really need to understand how and why we oppress and abuse in the first place. So basically, if we want to create a better world, we need to change the way we relate.
I learned a lot just in that paragraph that you just said. It sounds like this is a story as an aside that came up while you were speaking, how we can be so entrenched that we don't even realize our mentality is, as I think a lot of Carnists don't realize their speciesism, how they think they're better than different animals, so they can, therefore it's okay to treat them badly. And people, my theory is that we mistreat the earth because we're so anthropocentric. We believe everything revolves around us, and that everything, the earth and animals are all lesser. So that is such a great explanation. Thank you. Also reminds me of a time not long ago when I was with a 25-year-old and he wanted to play a game. We were in a group and he wanted to play a game. And it turns out it was like a card game or something. And I said, okay, even though I don't like games, because I just wanted to be a good, group person. So I said, sure, I'll play. It turns out this game, which I think he said, the way you win is when everybody wins. And I was like, what? I can't even grasp that. He said, yeah, you have to work towards everyone winning, and that's how you win. I'm like, what? Because I had grown up only with games where you won and everyone else lost or you lost, So it was mind-blowing to me. And it was actually fun. I had a good time because it was such a weird, my brain had to keep working extra hard to change. And so it sounds like your concept is kind of that. Once we start realizing that the way to win is not about us winning, but everybody winning, then there is success in the world overall.
Right? That's actually a great example. And, these cooperative games that, you're referring to are, really trying to condition kids and adults as well to think differently, to think instead of me versus you, to think instead of like, either or, to think an and but, me and you. So yeah, absolutely. And when we talk a little bit more about sort of the antidote to relational dysfunction, I think this will become even more clear. Your point will be even, more clearly taken.
So give us an example in your life of a relational dysfunction that changed you immensely when you were 4, and a relational success that also you had when you were young, which really helped you, well, I think made you the Dr. Melanie Joy who you are today with your research.
Well, why don't I talk about the opposite of relational dysfunction first, and then I can give a couple of examples of, to answer your question. So relational function being this dysfunction, being this common denominator driving, injustices, and not just the big injustices, like I said. I mean, if you look at the most pressing problems, not only in our world, but also in our personal lives, the problems we have in our relationships, the problems we have in our family systems, the problems we have, relating with, sometimes friends and colleagues and workplaces. We can see that the problems tend to be relational dysfunction. In the more extreme form, we would call them sort of toxic interactions or toxic relationships. So because relational dysfunction is this common denominator driving these problems, a common denominator in helping transform or resolving all of these problems is what I call relational literacy. Relational literacy is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. One of the most important things that any one of us can do as individuals for ourselves and our own lives and our relationships, and as people who want to contribute to creating a better world for all beings, is to commit to building relational literacy. The more relationally literate we are, the less likely we are to water the seeds of relational dysfunction in our interactions, but also collectively. We would not, if our collective level of relational literacy were not so low, we wouldn't vote for, relationally dysfunctional leaders or support relationally toxic and unhealthy policies and practices. We would recognize these problems for what they are. I often say that I'm always shocked that most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and we don't get a single formal lesson in how to be healthy relational beings. And when you look at the problems in our world today, most of these problems are not caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. So, in my own life, I can say building relational literacy, it's just been a game changer. It's like the difference between, in some ways, the difference between literacy, being literate, being able to read and write, and not. When you build relational literacy, even if you build it by 5 or 10%, your whole life can really transform. It just gets so much easier. Your connections get so much more authentic and deeper, and you can learn that you can approach, when you can communicate in a way that's healthy, right? And communication, I should say, is the primary way we relate. Most relational dysfunction is expressed, through our communication. When you learn how to communicate in an effective way, you can talk about basically anything without arguing. And when you don't know how to do that, you can't talk about anything without arguing. You probably know people, who are on the same page about just about everything, but seem to find a way to fight with each other. Nevertheless,
being able to receive communication is important too. And I say that as someone who gets defensive when my husband wants to correct me because, and he's usually right, but I want to be right. So I get defensive. And I feel like that is it's my worst trait, actually, is not being able to receive a communication well.
Right. And you make a really good point. So communication is a two-way street. And when I talk about communication, I'm actually talking about both sides of this, being effective at receiving communication and also at expressing a communication. And sometimes, one of the beauties of building relational literacy and really understanding effective communication is you can a lot of the communication that is not functional, that's not healthy, right, or not skillful, we don't identify it. We can't see it for what it is. So sometimes we come out of maybe you've had this experience where you have a conversation and you come away from that conversation, you just feel a little smaller, like a little bit less good about yourself. And you can't put your finger on why. You just don't feel that good about yourself. When you identify the very specific behaviors that reflect healthy and unhealthy or effective and ineffective communication, you can identify these. So for, going back to your example, It's possible that you, for whatever reason, everybody has their emotional allergies, and it's possible that you have an allergy against certain types of correction being given to you, and that just gets your bristles up, and it's really hard for you. It's also possible that the way that your husband is delivering the information is not as skillful as it could be. And perhaps there's some subtext in that or some undertone in that you're actually picking up on, and that's what you're reacting to.
I wish, but no, it's me. But you have that's the point, is that we subtly get messages more than just the words.
That's right. Like, so somebody can give you, feedback that's actually not critical feedback in the words that they're using, but there's a subtext that actually is critical. And then that's often what we respond to in a communication, is what's not being spoken, but being communicated nevertheless. Right. So this is sort of the beauty of being able to build your relational muscles, essentially your relational skills, is you can really start to hone in, and you hone in on the problems, and also you have a skillful way of navigating these problems. You had asked me about my own experience of relational dysfunction. Relational dysfunction is an extreme. In its extreme is violence. But most relational dysfunction looks quite different. It's a lot more subtle.
It usually starts at small and continues and then gets bigger and bigger.
It certainly can. I mean, and in relational dysfunction, it shows up in so many ways. And I'm actually thinking that it might be useful for listeners so this isn't an abstraction, to actually break this down for them. So when I'm talking about, when we're talking about relational dysfunction and relational literacy, they actually have an image in their mind, something practical that they can latch onto to really understand this. So I'm going to talk just briefly about what I call the formula for healthy relating, to sort of start mapping this out for people here, if that's okay. Relational literacy is made up of a number of principles and practices and tools. And I mean, the nice thing is that anybody who wants to build relational literacy can. Like, it really is. It's not rocket science. They just need the right tools and the practice. But relational literacy, all of these principles and practices are based on what I call the formula for healthy relating. And I touched on this earlier when we were talking. This is a formula that applies to every single interaction or relationship that we can have. Like, a relationship is actually just a series of interactions, if you think about it. So it applies to our communication. Communication, as I said, is the primary way we relate. It applies to how we interact as social groups. It applies to how we interact with other individuals, how we interact in the collective, how we interact with other animals and the environment, and how we interact with ourselves, right? So our primary relationship is with ourselves. We are always relating to ourselves every minute of every day through, for example, our self-talk. You've probably noticed that you have a voice in your head that's talking to you all the time. And chances are you communicate with yourself in a way that you wouldn't tolerate from other people, because most of us don't have the most compassionate, relationally healthy voice in our own heads. And you're also relating to yourself through the choices that you make that affect your future self. Right. And so those choices and that communication with yourself can be more or less, dysfunctional or healthy, functional. So the formula is this: in a healthy interaction, we practice integrity, as I said, and that means we practice respect. We treat others the way we would want to be treated if we were in their position, and we honor their dignity. And again, if we're interacting with ourselves, we're doing this to ourselves. We're practicing respect and honoring our own dignity, right, to ourselves. And this creates a sense of security and connection. And so just to make this less abstract, for even more so, think about a relationship in your life that you would consider a healthy like a good relationship, a really good relationship. My guess is that other person, you really trust that other person respects you. They treat you the way they would want to be treated if they were in your position. And they really honor your dignity. They don't look down on you. They don't see you as less worthy of having your needs met, being respected, of occupying space on this planet. And chances are you feel secure with this person and you feel connected with them. Right?
Yes, yes.
So,
I do.
and go ahead.
I do. And that inspires me to do the same with them. If I
Bingo.
don't feel secure or connected, I will be more apt to feel bad, and therefore I'll lash out, I'll protect, I'll withdraw, all things that aren't very good at in terms of connection or communication.
Right. But you make such an important point, because the more you practice the formula towards somebody else, the more you increase the chances that they are going to practice integrity as well, that they're going to practice the formula as well. And vice versa. Like most things in life, an interaction or a relationship isn't, dysfunctional or functional. It's not unhealthy or healthy. It's more or less so, right? So the formula for healthy relating, it exists on a spectrum, right? So on one end of the spectrum, we've been talking about are healthy or functional behaviors and attitudes. On the other end are dysfunctional or unhealthy behaviors and attitudes. And, on this other end of the spectrum, I call these non-relational. So relational attitudes and behaviors are healthy, and non-relational ones are unhealthy. And these dysfunctional ones are the opposite, right? They violate integrity and harm dignity and create a sense of insecurity and disconnection. So if you think about a relationship that you have, maybe it's with somebody you've never even met before, like an online troll, or something that's not a good relationship. Chances are you feel that this other person does not treat you with respect. You feel that they don't honor your dignity. They look down on you and see you as less than, not deserving this respect. And chances are you feel insecure with them and you feel disconnected from them. And to your point, chances are you're going to be defensive around them and more likely to treat them similarly. So, and this formula, this is at the foundation of all relational behaviors and attitudes. And you can, the nice thing about the formula is you can come back to it at any moment. Like anytime you're in an interaction, you're in a communication, you feel like it's starting to go sideways, you check in with yourself and you notice how you're feeling in this communication. You say, oh, I don't feel so good. You can ask yourself, wow, do I feel like this person is practicing integrity toward me? Are they treating me with respect? Do I feel like they're honoring my dignity? Or am I doing this to them? Right? So this is sort of like this can act as sort of like our relational compass, something that we can always come back to. So this is the foundation of healthy and unhealthy relational behaviors. So they can look like anything. It's like, shaming, anything that's shaming is relationally dysfunctional, non-relational, right? And so, even a subtle put down is non-relational. And that's very often how this shows up. You're trying to communicate to somebody, you're trying to advocate to them, you're talking about veganism with somebody who's not a vegan. And, you're making subtle comments about, how they're causing harm in the world, or they're, not as morally, admirable as you are, or whatever.
It's great that you said that about shaming and gave an example, because a lot of people feel two things that came up during what you just said. One is that we all feel we did it right and the other person's reacting. And it's, that happens a lot where people go, no, I was nice. I was this, I was that. We don't realize that we're treating someone badly. And I kind of thought that was because we weren't using the right words, we weren't using I words, and we were, but maybe it sounds like your solution is to think in concepts rather than actual this step and that step and say this and that. Like my sister and I talk a lot about nonviolent communication and try and use that, which is a NVC, is a way of talking to people in a very specific steps when you're dealing, especially with hard conversations.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
When you say honor dignity, what does that mean in a very practical conversation?
Well, I'm glad that you asked this, and I'm glad, that you're making the distinction between words and something beyond words, right? So every communication, we can, talk about communication now since it's the primary way we relate, but this applies to, relating in general. Every communication has two parts to it. One part is the content. That's the words. That's what we're saying, right? So the content right now is communication. The other part is the process. The process is how we're communicating. And, we tend to over-focus on the content and to think, I've just got to get the words right. I just need to use I language. The content does matter, right? It is important to use words that are compassionate and so on. But the process matters more. We over-focus on the content and we under-focus on the process, but the process matters more. So for example, think about a conversation that you had 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, maybe at a dinner party, or just a random conversation you were having. Chances are you may have forgotten the entire content. You don't even remember what you talked about, but you probably still remember how you felt in that conversation. Mm-hmm. The process determines how you feel. When your process is healthy, you can communicate about anything, and without arguing. When your process is unhealthy, you can't communicate about anything without arguing, probably. So in a healthy process, we practice the formula, and in a healthy process, our goal is not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong. Our goal is not to win, which means to make the other person lose. This is why the debate model, tends to be counterproductive in most situations. And we can talk more about that if you want. In a healthy process, our goal is mutual understanding. Our goal, the only reason we communicate is because we're not mind readers. Communication is the reason we communicate is to get the other person, help the other person understand what we're thinking, feeling, and needing, and to understand what they think and feel and maybe need. That's it. So the goal needs to be mutual understanding. And, the secondary goal can be, maybe, okay, I want you to take this into consideration, whatever. But if that isn't the first goal, then the rest of the conversation is going to be very difficult. And healthy communication or effective communication, it starts in your heart. It starts with your intention, right? And if you go into a conversation, your intention is to be right, is to win, is to change the other person's mind, is to make them realize that they are wrong, or that there's something wrong with them. First of all, they're probably going to pick up on that. Secondly, those feelings are going to drive your behaviors in different ways. And so one of the most important ways that we can relate in a way that's more skillful is to shift the way that we think about relating in the first place and the way that we think about other people in the first place. And one way to do this is to recognize the core myth, the fundamental myth that drives a lot of our behavior, particularly, when we're getting a little bit charged up. And this is what I call the myth of a hierarchy of moral worth. It's a belief that some individuals are more worthy of being treated with respect than others. And if you really think about it, I'm going to take this out of the abstract in a second. If you really look at all of these non-relational systems, these unjust systems, racism, patriarchy, carnism, speciesism, classism, this myth is at the foundation of this myth is at the center of those. Certain individuals are more deserving, worthy of having their interests respected, of being respected than others, of having their dignity honored than others. And when we take it out of these systems, We can look at this inside of ourselves. This core myth drives the non-relational mentality. When we are angry at someone, when we are triggered by somebody, just think about your own experience. We can suddenly see them somehow as less than in our minds, less worthy of being treated with respect. Oh, you eat animals? You don't deserve my respect. Oh, you voted for this candidate? You talked this way, you did this horrible thing, you've insulted me in this way. We have all sorts of reasons in our minds as to why somebody is less worthy of being treated with respect. And as soon as we believe that, then we feel like we have a right to say whatever we want to them, and that drives us. But recognizing this myth for what it is can be transformative. And to recognize this myth reflects a profound misunderstanding of human psychology and human behavior. Nobody on this planet, it can be anything more or anything less than the biology and hardwiring we were born with and every single experience we have had throughout our lives. You cannot be any different than who and how you are because of who and how you are. So when we expect people to be different from who and how they are, it's like expecting a tree that's been rained on not to be wet. So this doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable for problematic behaviors. It simply means that we can do that without harming their dignity. You look at people who are in prison for heinous crimes that they've committed. But guess what? If you were born into that person's life and you lived through what they did and you had their brain wiring, that would be you.
You live in Germany, where they have a very different outlook on how to treat people who have broken the law. It was so interesting. That was another mind-blowing thing I saw on 60 Minutes a few years ago. Okay, so what I'm learning from you is that, because what resonated with me is that I realized that in most of my conversations, it's about getting me heard and me and them agreeing and them thinking I'm right. And I think if I have a hierarchy, a moral hierarchy, it's usually not about thinking they're less, but just that I'm better. Because I think I'm so me. It's not like you're less than me. It's just that I'm better than you. I'm smarter. I have the right opinions. So that's how I frame it. Other people might frame it differently. Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing from you is that if I go into my conversations not wanting to win or change, but instead looking for security and connection with that person, I will change completely as a conversationalist in my interaction with that person.
Yeah, if you're guided, in your conversations, not by perceiving yourself as better because when you perceive yourself as better, you automatically perceive the other person as worse, whether it's worse in their opinion or, whatever. But if you're driven, if you're drawn, if you come to these conversations, and of course, we're all works in progress, we all have a lot of baggage and this is easier said than done. But if you're motivation in your conversations is mutual understanding. I want to get to a place of security and connection in this conversation. Like, what will help us feel more secure and connected? What will help, I want to understand your thoughts and feelings. I want you to understand my thoughts and feelings. I want relational integrity here. That is relational integrity. That can really transform your conversations. The motivation we bring to our conversations shapes to a large degree the way those conversations unfold. And, you can feel it. When somebody is talking to you and they have an agenda and it's a hidden agenda and the agenda is to basically prove that you're wrong, and they're right. You're probably picking up on that in some way. And if that is your motivation, it's going to make it harder for you to actually listen to them because you're going to be so focused on getting them to listen to you.
Right. And I think you remind me of the game I played with that 25-year-old and a couple other 25-year-olds where every move I had to rethink because my natural instinct was to do a move that would be good for me. And instead I had to remember, oh, no, my end game literally is different than what I've been taught for 60 years. Infighting.org, your website talks about how we can communicate better. And I love there's a lot of different things we can do to communicate better, just like you've talked about. But on a more granular level, you have it on that site. And you have a page which lists some of them, and there were three that I wanted to discuss. And one is avoid defining reality, using person-centered language, and not aiming at winning, which we've actually talked about, not aiming at winning. So maybe we should, if you could just talk about avoiding defining reality. That probably hit me because it must be something that I probably do. And using person-centered language, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah,
I like
sure.
I like concrete things. Dotsie, if she were here, she would like be into the big concepts. I like, okay, step one and step two.
But we need that because without the concrete practical application, we need to be able to apply the concepts. So you're 100%. And, this is why we launched infighting.org, and wanted to make sure that there were a lot of practical tools in that. Same thing with how to end injustice. The last chapter is on how to end infighting, with very practical tools to do that, and also other communication tools. So you asked about defining reality. So when we define somebody's reality, basically what we do is we make ourselves the expert on their experience. So defining somebody's reality is communicating to somebody that their perceptions of their own experience are wrong. So for example, a child has just finished eating dinner and says to their parents, "I'm hungry." And the parent says, "Well, you can't be hungry, you just ate." So the child is learning to distrust the signals their body is giving them, right? Or somebody says, "Oh, a non-vegan," and by the way, I don't use the term carnist, I use carnistic as an adjective. In the first version of Why We Love Dogs, the original version, I used carnist, and unfortunately, some people started using it as a slur, and it was misinterpreted. And I have since retired the word and used the adjective, and which is more respectful, I think. So I'm saying non-vegans now to refer to people who eat animals.
Well, it's person-centered language, right?
It's person-centered also, and yes. And so, right, I'll get into that in just a second. Right. More person-centered, I would say. So let's say a non-vegan says to a vegan, "I love animals." Like a typical response is, "No, you don't, you eat them." Right. So like here, the vegan is making themselves an expert on the emotional, like the internal emotional experience of somebody who's not them. How do you know? Or maybe you've said to a friend before, like, "Oh my God, I'm really sorry, I'm late for dinner." And your friend says, "Well, I know you're still mad at me about that argument we had last week." And this is sort of passive aggressive. Like that person's making themselves an expert on your motivation. So when we define somebody's reality, we tell them that their perceptions, their motivation, their feelings are wrong. And that is kind of guaranteed to create defensiveness and insecurity and disconnection. It's like antithetical to the formula we were talking about. We all do it because we've all learned to do it. We just need to do it less to the degree that we can. And once you recognize that you can never know what's true for somebody else, you're less likely to do that. So, examples of defining reality are, they abound, but you can see this in, like, I think on infighting.org, I have examples of, vegans posting things about other vegans, saying like they're angry at an organization and saying, "Oh, that organization's only running that campaign because they want to make money. They don't care about animals. They just want to make money." Or, "This vegan influencer just wants to make a name for themselves. They don't care about animals." It usually comes down to, you don't care about animals. You're just advocating veganism for some other reason, which is like deeply, deeply painful for people to hear who are, trying to make the world a better place for animals who are being tortured to death every second, every day, and are acutely aware of that. So those are examples of defining reality. But we all, like, if people listening are thinking like, "Oh my God, I define reality all the time," it's because you were born under the sign of human, and it's what we've all learned to do. And the less you can do it, the better. Just catch yourself when you can. Person-centered language is communicating. I actually think of, person is a little bit limiting because we're not thinking about, animals, including animals in that, but this is what the frame is, what people say is person-centered language, is language that doesn't reduce a person or an individual to a descriptor. So for example, in psychology, people used to, and some people still do use these words, but they're becoming less and less frequently used. They used to say, "Oh, this person, is a depressive versus they have depression, or this person is an anorexic, or this person is a schizophrenic versus this is a person who has anorexia. This is a person who has schizophrenia. You don't reduce a person to a pathology, right? And so person-centered language, in the vegan movement, for example, would be, don't refer to somebody as a welfarist, for instance, particularly if that's not a label they would assign to themselves, because then you're defining reality and you're not using person-centered language. So there are lots of different ways that we can use person-centered language, but whenever you notice you're reducing somebody to an adjective, try to separate the person from the adjective. And there was a third one, I think you were going to say discuss rather than debate.
Not aiming at winning, which is, basically discuss, not, so please feel free to discuss that.
Yeah, sure. So the debate model is based on this sort of win-lose, it's a win-lose model. And it's effective in only a very small handful of situations, right? So if you're in a courtroom, for instance, if you're running for political office, you'd want to use the debate model. Apart from that, it tends to be counterproductive, right? When you invite somebody to debate, right? Let's say that you're a vegan, you have a different idea of how to advocate veganism, different strategic approach, and you want to talk about this with another vegan, or you're a vegan and you're talking to a non-vegan about the ethics of eating animals or not eating animals, right? When you invite that other person to debate you, basically you're inviting them to do their best to win because nobody wants to lose. You're inviting them to come up with every possible argument they can as to why they're right and you're wrong. And by the end of that debate, chances are that other person will have worked hard to convince themselves of the rightness of their position and may even be even more entrenched in the position than they were before. When we discuss, the goal is not to win. It's mutual understanding. As I said before, when you invite somebody into a discussion, you're inviting them to share ideas and to learn from your ideas.
I think curiosity is really important there because we don't become curious
Totally.
about the other person, and asking more questions of them rather than making statements is sort of a good rule of thumb to go by when having difficult conversations that are aimed at understanding rather than winning.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point.
What are some of the obstacles that you talk about how we grow up with this feeling disconnected from beings and the planet and things like that? What are some of the internal or external obstacles to feeling connected with others?
I think one of our biggest obstacles is this belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, where we can get into this mindset that as soon as we get upset with somebody, we suddenly become very convinced in the rightness of our position and feel very justified in defending ourselves and reacting however we want to. A big obstacle, I could go on and on about this, but I think one that's really important for, a very important one that just in understanding can actually help reduce the obstacle is not being aware of the difference between relating to our anger in a healthy way versus an unhealthy way. So anger is like really learning how to relate to our anger differently for most people can be very, very useful. So anger is the emotional response to witnessing or experiencing an injustice. We get angry when we see something that's unfair, right? So if you're standing in line at CVS and somebody cuts in the front of the line, you've been waiting there, you're going to get angry. People eating animals, you're going to get angry. So it's, and when we relate to our anger is a really important emotion, right? It alerts us to the fact that our moral compass is working. It's giving us important information that there may be an injustice. And I say maybe an injustice because we can get angry at something that's not an injustice. Like if we feel entitled to have our partner clean the house every single day and make food for us before we get home, and we fly into a rage when they haven't done that, that may not be appropriate anger. But so your anger we relate to our anger in a healthy way when we recognize it for what it is, which is a data point. It is nothing more and nothing less than an emotion. And it's an emotion that's giving us information that we're experiencing something that might be unjust. That's relating to our anger in a healthy way. We can learn from it. What's going on here? And our anger can motivate us to take action, to rectify a problem, to stand up against an injustice. When we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way, rather than identifying it as an emotion, as a data point, we blend with it. We become merged with it. We and the anger become one. We look at the world through the lens of our anger, right? So instead of saying, I'm feeling angry, or better yet, a part of me is feeling angry. And if you ever want to reduce your feeling of anger quickly, that's one thing you can do. A part of me is feeling angry right now, as opposed to, I am angry. I and the anger are one. So we blend with our anger. And on top of that, our anger usually has the charge of contempt. And contempt is the biggest relationship killer that exists, right? So contempt is basically, it's the opposite of shame, right? When we feel contempt, it means that we've placed ourselves in a position of superiority to somebody else, moral superiority to somebody else. We're looking down on them and seeing them as less than. We're buying into the hierarchy of moral worth, right? Mm-hmm. And studies have shown that contempt is the one emotion most likely to destroy a relationship. Right. And it does, when you're on the receiving end of somebody's contempt, all you want to do is you put up that wall, you pull back, you fight them, So this is really, really important information for us to have. And so one thing that you can do, for listeners who are curious about this is when you're feeling angry, pause and ask yourself, okay, what is my anger telling me? What am I angry at? What information is my anger giving me right now? And do I find myself in a position of moral superiority? Am I actually looking down on somebody and judging them as being less good of a person, even if it's very subtle? And if that's the case, then that's an indication that you've lost connection with your empathy. It's impossible to look down on somebody if you're looking at the world through their eyes. And so just this shift into empathy can make a really big difference.
In your book, Powerarchy, you talk about how we accept different people accept certain kinds of oppression, and they might be horrified at other kinds of oppression. For example, I'll use myself as an example. My husband eats meat, and I adore him. We've been together almost 30 years. He still is perfect. We are very deeply in love. I don't try and change him in this area. I don't try and change him at all, actually. It's not even in this area. If he were a bigot, a sexist, I would never have been with him. Mm. So I clearly have a hierarchy of values because animal rights is hugely important to me. And I believe he is incredibly misguided, but I don't change him. Whereas I would have, if he did exhibit bigotry, I would speak up right away. So help me understand, all of us understand why some oppression we react differently to than others. I mean, I feel like I'm just more accepting of the oppression of animals in society when I communicate. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's a really, really tricky question. And my guess is that, even though, as we've been talking about, and as my research has demonstrated, even though we know that the non-relational mentality looks the same, no matter who it's being directed at, right? It's the same mentality that enables us to harm human animals, enables us to harm non-human animals, right? It's the same way of thinking. It's violating the formula, essentially. Even though this is true, there are still nuances, okay? So, it makes me think of you may have heard that some vegans refer to meatless Mondays as rape-free, meat-free Mondays as rape-free Thursdays. I don't know if you've ever heard that comparison before.
No, interesting.
No. Yeah. So kind of comparing these things, saying if you're not eating meat for one day, it's like saying you're not raping for one day. You're these same, there's the similar mentality driving both of them. Right. But it's not the same, because rape is perceived, recognized, at least in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places in the world today, as reprehensible as it should be. Bigotry, various forms of bigotry are recognized as reprehensible. And so for somebody to act against social norms in such a way, they have to be deeply entrenched in bigotry and probably have a substantial amount of contempt that is driving those actions. Whereas eating animals is not only is it a social norm, but it's a socially celebrated behavior. It takes a different type of psychology, right, to go out and actively harm or act in ways that are actively and overtly bigoted. I mean, and I don't mean to say that bigotry doesn't exist in the Western world and in the US. It obviously does, it clearly does. Most people today, particularly progressive people, and people who really want to think of themselves, for whom it's important to think of themselves as a basically good person, would not knowingly, act in ways or communicate in ways that are bigoted. And yet that same person might eat animals and think nothing of it simply because eating animals is such a celebrated social norm. It's a different type of psychology. And my guess is that your husband is not contemptuous of animals, hating on farmed animals, sort of actively thinking of them as lesser beings. He's just actually checked out and not making the connection. He's not making the connection, which is quite different than somebody who's like actively misogynistic or actively racist. It's not that they're not making the connection. It's that they are being driven by a certain level of moral superiority and contempt.
One last question. How are you different in your own life? Because you've spent decades researching how to have better communication and live with more integrity and honoring dignity of other people. How does that show up in your life? Different from before when you learned all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's just as I was saying earlier, and I wish I had known when I was younger what I know now, because my life would have been very different. Like so many of the, kind of painful endings of relationships, for example, or even endings of relationships, they just wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have happened that way for sure. So it's easier. And this is a work in progress. I'm a human being just like everybody else. So it's not that I'm, kind of skating through life and relational perfection or anything like that. But I do have the relationships that I have in my life are healthy relationships, and the connections I have are really authentic connections. And I don't think that would have been possible in the same way if I hadn't been able, or if I weren't able to bring a certain level of skill and authenticity to my relationships. It just makes life easier. It makes it easier for me to, avoid arguments and, not avoid conversations, but avoid arguments, knowing how to have the conversations in a way that reduces the chances that they'll turn into arguments. And this is not because I'm unique or I'm special. It's simply because I've learned the tools, and that's it. And that's really what I think is so wonderful and important for people to understand. Like, you don't have to be a psychologist to communicate effectively. You don't have to, do a huge amount of work to build relational literacy. It's quite straightforward. And of course, you need to be, willing to self-reflect and grow yourself. But a lot of the tools for building relational literacy are the tools for building self-awareness as well. And so you kind of you can use your communication, your relationships as a training ground on which you can sort of grow and relationally mature yourself. It's really a beautiful thing. So, and it's not that hard. It's quite straightforward. So this was what motivated me a few years ago to write my book, Getting Relationships Right, which is, I wrote that to be a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. I wanted a book I could hand people and say, look, this is sort of the primer. This is the foundation, read this, and hopefully, this will help if you can even build your relational skills by 5% or 10%. It could be life-changing. So, and especially people who want to change the world, people who are advocating for non-human beings or human beings. The more relational skills we build, the more effectively we're going to be able to do the work that we're doing to advocate, to be effective ambassadors for the cause, and to create healthy and resilient groups and movements.
Well, thank you so much. Our audience can learn so much from all your books. I've read several of them, and they are wonderful and easy to read, even though the concepts are well, they come from great scholarly research, but you're able to write the books in a way that is, very relatable to people like I. Um, so tell us where people can find your latest book, How to End Injustice Everywhere, and your other books. So if they want to learn, for example, how to get relationships right, they can find that, and also your work online.
Yeah, sure. They can come to carnism.org is everything is there. And our infighting website, infighting.org, has a page that's dedicated to how to end injustice everywhere. It gives an overview of the book and the trailer of the book as well.
Yeah, that's a great page too. Very informative. Thank you so much, Dr. Joy, for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been, as always, a pleasure. You're so easy to talk to. I love it.